Thank you, Sheila. Welcome, of course, to this first session of the second day of STS 2020. The second day is bigger and better even than the first day. You'll notice a few things have changed about the schedule. We now have not one, but two discussants. We have extra time, and we begin not with mere introducers, but with provocateurs. I should just say very quickly, what I work on is discussing boundaries, the history of theoretical physics, and I swear to God this makes sense in my head, science, colonialism, and post-colonial theory. I think it's the latter that we'll be touching on more here. We have three wonderful people who'll be speaking in this session. I'll just say all of them have published an enormous amount. I'm just going to flag a couple of things for all of them. Our first speaker is Kaushik Sundararajan from the University of Chicago, who, as I say, have published many things. One of them is 2006, Biocapital, the Constitution of Post-Genomic Life. Our first discussant is David Winikoff from UC Berkeley. Again, a lot of publications, but one that was mentioned yesterday, we didn't get the full citation, was Judicial Imaginaries of Technology, Constitutional Law, and the DNA Roundup in the book edited by Sheila Jasnoff, Reframing Rights. And then our second discussant, third speaker, Javier Lezone from the Said School in Oxford. Again, it's published a great deal. I'm just going to mention one co-edited volume from 2009, very recent, on catastrophe, law, politics, and the humanitarian impulse. So let's begin with provoking thoughts from Kaushik.
Thanks, Suman. Thanks also to Sheila, not just for this invitation, but because she has and continues to be a teacher for many years, and those are debts that are not easily repaid, if ever. Is the mic working?
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm not used to being intentionally provocative, but that's my brief. So here goes. So if I end up being so, then apologies in advance. So. I wish to address my provocations from the perspective of my corner of STS, which focuses on contemporary issues in the life sciences and society. My closest interlocutors work in the arena of the biopolitical, referring to Michel Foucault's notion of epistemic and institutional regimes that put life at the center of political calculation. My fundamental disagreement with many such conceptualizations, and I think especially of the important work of Nicholas Rose and Paul Rabinow, are the ways in which advanced liberal societies become the normative forging grounds of the biopolitical. There is no serious consideration of what one might call biopolitics elsewhere, except as conceptually derivable from the biopolitics of Western liberalism and neoliberalism. There have been some attempts to seriously think about the biopolitical in other contexts in ways that are not simply derivative, but most of these attempts come from a disciplinary context of medical anthropology and draw upon the historical conceit and ability of anthropology as a discipline to concern itself with the other. This difficulty in thinking about biopolitics elsewhere, I would argue, is just one instance of a more general problem that STS has had in thinking seriously about technoscience in non-advanced liberal terms, except in terms, either comparative or relativist, that are derivable from the West. My provocation today is that a concern with such elsewheres is essential for understanding contemporary technoscience. This is resolutely not a suggestion that everyone in STS must start doing projects in non-Euro-American locales. I'm interested, rather, in thinking of questions of technoscience in the context of its globalization and arguing for a post-colonial attentiveness for STS. This implies recognizing, at the very least, that technoscience has colonial histories and presence. Understanding technoscience today requires taking into account the enduring histories of exploitation, expropriation, resource extraction, and inequality that structure global flows of knowledge, resources, capital, labor, and expertise. But it also involves accounting for the ways in which the post-colonial is being refigured in the world of technoscience. I think here of a table that Donna Haraway drew in Modest Witness, which pointed to the stark inequalities in productive capacities in the life sciences globally, with virtually all life science research in the 1990s being conducted in the United States, Europe, and to some extent Japan. I'm certain that table would start looking very different now. This is because of serious capacity building for the life sciences occurring globally, especially in Southeast and Southeast Asia. This is not simply a question of more people or places doing cutting-edge science, It is potentially a question of the very refiguration of what constitutes global relationality and technoscientific capability, in ways that at least force us to ask questions of whether and how typical colonial relationships of metropole to periphery might be under transformation. I wish to provide a brief example from my own research. I'm following the establishment of the Translational Health Science and Technology Institute of India, or THSTI, which is being established as part of a larger biotechnology cluster in Faridabad, India, partly in collaboration with MIT. Translational research in its most straightforward formulation is an imagination of biological research that can move from the lab to impact society, though there are many different ideas and ideals of what it is in practice. At its core, it involves institutional development. Given its very nature, one cannot pretend that translational research is purely a scientific or technological activity. Even the most unimaginative of translational researchers must necessarily have a sociological imaginary. Today, I wish to hone in on this particular relationship between MIT and the Indian scientists in building THSTI. There are two simplified linear narratives at play here. One is the global player narrative, which suggests that collaborations with prestigious institutions such as MIT are both the route to and recognition of India's emergence as a force to be reckoned with in the global knowledge economy. The other is the neo-colonial narrative, which suggests that institutional arrangements in which universities like MIT, with little or no context for Indian social reality, tell Indians how to build institutions and prioritize research is absurd at best, and a reinscription of imperialist forms of expert knowledge flows. Needless to say, both these narratives, which exist quite powerfully alongside each other, have elements of truth and are too simple. What interests me for today's purposes, however, is the question of differential sociological imaginaries that structure predominantly MIT-based imaginations of THSTI compared to those that structure the imaginations of at least some scientists based in India. Both at a larger ideational level and at the level of practical minutiae involved in the everyday aspects of institution building, there are utterly different implicit and explicit ideas of what constitutes the social. In terms of ideas, there is a certain MIT sensibility that can be caricatured as technocratic. This grants the importance of social context and social impact, especially for something like translational research. It even recognizes the particularity and situatedness of MIT's own ecosystem, and does not presume that this can or should be replicated in an Indian context. But it still believes in the priority of the technological artifact, the idea that ultimately the translational challenge is about the development of new technologies, that the creation of institutional and political structures that creatively allow for the dissemination of that technology is important, but somehow separate or subsequent. This technocratic idea of translation is undoubtedly present amongst a number of Indian scientists as well, but it is in tension with another sensibility, one that does not presume the priority of the technological, but that is deeply co-productionist at its core. This is articulated in the insistence of Satyajit Rath, a key figure in the development of THSTI, that, to quote, translation is not about artifacts, but about policies, close quote. That, for example, a truly translational imaginary would not be concerned with how to come up with a new drug for tuberculosis that could then be made accessible to all those who need it, but would rather begin with the question of what an adequate policy for tuberculosis prevention and treatment would be. The development of drugs and diagnostics could undoubtedly be part of such a policy, but this kind of institutionalization of translation could not allow a separation between science and policy, the technical and the socio-political, and would require serious and novel kinds of epistemic partnership across these different domains of technoscientific and social scientific expertise. In terms of the minutiae of institutional development also, there are differences. For instance, the American insistence on institutional branding and a corporate-like communication strategy, the willingness to take risks and bet on potential when it comes to hiring junior faculty, the enormous attentiveness given to letters of recommendation in evaluating candidates, the valuing of candidate recruitment and the mentoring of junior faculty, all have different resonances in the Indian context, where informal social networks are often far more effective at branding an institution than websites and logos, where letters of recommendation and faculty mentoring are viewed with a certain degree of suspicion, given the histories of nepotism and feudal patronage that have structured Indian institutional development traditionally, and where potential is always in tension with the question of whether infrastructure exists on the ground in ways that allow a realization of that potential. Hence, different ideas and ideals of the social and the sociological exist both at the level of big ideas and small processes. These different ideas and ideals of translation and institutionalization have tangible consequences. Research agendas, the careers of junior faculty, the legacies of more senior faculty, and a not inconsiderable amount of Indian taxpayers' money are all at stake here. Further, conceptually, one sees embedded in the very worlds of the actors that I'm studying, foundational articulations of different ideas and trajectories of STS. Indeed, the differing ideas of the relationship of technoscience to society, of the social as important to yet outside of the technoscientific on the one hand, or the social and the technoscientific deeply mutually imbricated on the other, harkens back to the distinction between ST and S, science, technology, and society, and S and TS, science and technology studies, which is operated on precisely these grounds. More strongly, one sees, especially marked amongst a number of key Indian scientists, and notably absent amongst virtually all US-based scientists in this initiative, an acknowledgement, even an understanding, of the co-production of the technoscientific and the social and institutional. I want to ask then, why or how is it that scientists in India often seem quite steeped in STS in ways that are markedly harder to see among scientists in the US? I've had a number of Indian biologists explain to me that the problem that you STS types have to unravel is, followed by a sophisticated statement of the theoretical and conceptual terrain that I'm negotiating. I've given talks in India where scientists in the audience have challenged me to situate my analysis in relation to the early works of Shiv Vishwanathan. But I also do not want to suggest that Indian scientists are not technocratic, or that all of them are critically attuned to a co-productionist worldview. Indeed, some of the least reflexive and most hyper-capitalist and hyper-imperialist positions I've encountered are also to be found amongst Indian biologists. Regardless, the spectrum of positions one finds in the Indian context are invariably more explicit in their articulation of their sociological imaginary than corresponding positions in the US context, where sociological imaginaries undoubtedly exist, but are often implicit or form a part of the naturalized and normative sense of objectivity upon which ideas of institution building are articulated. At stake here are different kinds of common sense about the world we live in. This is partly, no doubt, a result of Indian scientists having always had to function from a location that is both marginal and marked, making it impossible to assume, as American scientists often can, a culture of no culture as the location from which their science is produced. But it is also partly a function of the diasporic and cosmopolitan trajectories that most scientists involved in institutional development in India today have traversed. There is often experience of having worked in the US or Europe, and the acquisition of Western cultural and institutional knowledge that has to be learned in order to be a successful global scientist. This kind of cosmopolitan sensibility is invariably lacking in American biologists, who, when they do have to confront global life science communities, as they increasingly have to do, are able reflexively to imagine them as simply extensions, and sometimes imperfect ones, of scientific communities that they're accustomed to in the US and Europe. There is a way in which the universality of science seamlessly maps onto an implicit and assumed universality of the institutionalization of scientific practice, so that a confrontation with different kinds of norms, imaginaries, and expectations is often surprising. I want to suggest then that a global post-colonial sensibility is much more complicated than simply a registration of anti-colonial sentiments in other parts of the world. Indeed, as I just mentioned, in India, these kinds of anti-colonial sensibilities are often layered onto deep global neoliberal hyper-capitalist and hyper-imperialist aspirations. Post-coloniality, for my purposes, involves understanding that as much as anything else. Rather, I'm arguing for recognition of the ways in which technoscientific imaginaries and practices are multiply located. A global post-colonial sensibility is not just a project of registering difference elsewhere. It is a method by which we can usefully interrogate the norms and forms of scientific practice within advanced liberal economies and societies as well. This also means that the global post-colonial sensibility I'm arguing for avoids a certain kind of polarization within which critiques of technoscience in India have tended to be caught in the past, between, on the one hand, the various kinds of anti-science, anti-modern, anti-vivisectionist polemics of J.P.S. Uberoi, Ashish Nandi, Claude Alvarez, Vandana Shiva, and a certain moment in the work of Shiv Vishwanathan, and on the other hand, the relentlessly modernist counter-polemic of Meera Nanda. This is not the terrain upon which the kind of critical sensibility I'm arguing for operates. My provocation today has concerned itself entirely with the institutional dimensions of technoscience. But I do not want to suggest that writing about globalization simply implies writing about institutions, leaving out questions of the epistemic dimensions of science. This is especially because the basis of epistemic critique of the life science is, I believe, undergoing a revision as the life sciences have become, broadly speaking, post-genomic. STS scholars, through especially the 1980s and 1990s, cogently critiqued the predominant reductionism of the dominant biologies of the time and suggested that the complexity of life was surely not deductible from the dogmatic coding operations that were so often claimed as being foundational to the meaning of life itself. But in biology today, there's been a switch towards an embrace of greater complexity. Emergent subfields like proteomics, systems biology, epigenetics, studies of gene-environment interactions, and so on pose to us problems of great complexity. To quote Sarah Franklin, the silence of the genome has given way to the cacophony of the epigenetic. This presents questions for our own critical practice. A simply oppositional critique that points to the limits of the ideologies and practices of the life sciences, it is clear, won't do anymore. But is what is left simply archiving, documenting, keeping pace with the rapidity, complexity, and oftentimes magic of new developments in the life sciences? If so, with a critique. Where then does an analysis of the globalization of scientific institutions and practice leave us in terms of epistemic critique? After all, one of the enduring conceits of STS has been its ability to intervene in our understanding of the constitution of the epistemological foundations of scientific authority. Does the sort of sensibility that I'm arguing for simply pertain to the sociological or institutional dimensions of science? Is the trajectory that I've followed effectively a different kind of project altogether from critiques of post-genomic biology such as Sarah Franklin's? Or do differences in institutional worldviews differentially articulated in different spaces and contexts lead to different kinds of science? One of the fundamental and deeply important assumptions of science, held as fervently by Indian scientists who completely mark themselves as coming from a post-colonial location, as they are by culturally more unmarked scientists, is indeed its universality. Science practiced differently could lead to different kinds of institutions, different relationships to the social, and different imaginations of the social. But scientific epistemology often sees itself as needing to transcend that. If the Mertonian norms of communism has been unequivocally shattered by the corporatization of the life sciences over the past 3 or so decades, does the norm of universalism get shattered by its current globalization? I don't have answers to this, but I will end with the suggestion that thinking of biopolitics elsewhere is just a starting point for thinking about questions like this. But it's not enough, because the elsewhere suggests that the there of advanced liberalism is still the normative location against which science elsewhere is described, compared, or measured. The subtitle of Partha Chatterjee's book, Politics of the Governed, is Reflections on Popular Politics in Most of the World. By talking about elsewhere, I'm simply making an argument then for reflecting upon biopolitics and technoscience more generally in most of the world. Not simply as empirical or exemplary case studies, but as the forging grounds of conceptualization. I'm attempting to make an argument against a Eurocentric conceptualization of global technoscience, but also trying to avoid the move of scholars such as Ashish Nandi, who makes Eurocentrism synonymous with Enlightenment rationalism and ends up denouncing reason to court. That, I believe, is a costly move and leaves us simply with the alternatives of irrationalism, intuition, nature, or alterity as such. That is not the kind of difference that the Indian scientists I'm referring to are arguing for. Rather, my sensibility is closer to that put forward by Dipesh Chakrabarty, who attempts to link notions of locality and indigeneity to various global histories of capital. Scholars such as Chakrabarty are not STS scholars in any canonical sense, yet through their contributions to post-colonial theory, they open up questions of the politics of knowledge that are important, I would argue, for conceptualizing a global STS. Finally, the question of the universal and how and why the cultural interrupts it is centrally at stake here. Chakrabarty thinks through this question in relation to histories of capital. I would argue that it is worth thinking about this question also in relation to histories of science. So I leave these provocations at this point and look forward to David's and Javier's responses.
Javier, do you want to start us off by provoking the provoker, and then we'll get to David? Should we do it in that order, or
whatever?
Which order? Did you guys have an order worked out?
I was ready to jump in, but whatever.
Do you want to? Go ahead, David.
Well, just on that. Okay, if I could distill a central message of that well-spun, incredibly well-spoken, ridiculously articulate, given the hour, piece here. I agree with all of that in terms of its normative thrust, its intellectual interest, its political import. One thing that occurs to me is that one of the things I work on is the innovation of small, mundane technologies for the, quote, poor. And one thing that's very interesting that's happening in this area, which has long been constituted by things like cook stoves and water purifiers and this sorts of things. And this is very symbolic kinds of technologies for, in representing various kinds of things. From economic visions of economic development, sustainable development, gender equality, as embodied in various kinds of artifacts. The development of this field has really moved towards innovations that are coming from India in these veins. Many of the technologies haven't worked. They haven't worked for 30 years. They're not working better now. And far from the, I guess the sense that there's a continuing post-colonial emphasis or worldview in these U.S. communities, there's increasingly a sense, especially those involved in innovation and who had been involved in humanitarian innovation, is that there's this incredible upswell of innovative energy and vitality in these countries, and a shift of power in that sense. So some of this I see as not necessarily needing a trend that not necessarily needs a kind of unveiling to expose systems of power. To the contrary, I think there's actual the degree of vital energy that's coming from these places actually indicates there's, from a descriptive point of view, a shift in power taking place. So I wonder what that does to the area of post-colonial scholarship, as moving forward into this age of incredibly innovative, vital innovation. That's redundant, but innovation coming from the elsewheres that you're talking about. That's an immediate response, and perhaps you can comment on that. The other main comment deals with how you position yourself as an STS scholar in relationship to, very consciously, both anthropology and STS within a particular kind of vision of STS that we might call co-productionist, which perhaps more than in certain areas of STS explicitly engages with institutions, states, public power, these sorts of things, and sees and links, I would say, what is traditionally seen as the realm of political theory or political analysis with STS and anthropological analysis. And I think your scholarship in particular uses that location exceedingly well, in my view, the way it moves from the rich local description, embracing the resistance to universalizing on local kinds of areas of practice, whether they be biotech companies or industrial parks in the US, in India, but then link that to larger patterns of political economy and the state. And it's in those later kinds of linkages that I see my corner of STS, or my location, which is the legal scholar come STS scholar. And with a lot of colleagues in my institution, UC Berkeley, who are doing anthropology of STS, they would probably say, I've often tried to reflect on how STS relates to what they're doing, but also whether I do STS that's inspired by law or law that's inspired by STS. I've come to realize that I do both, Plus, I also do bioethics. So I'm crossing lots of kinds of boundaries and have to struggle with certain kinds of identifications. But what does law STS, how does that differ or complement a anthropological STS? That's one thing that I was thinking about and anticipating commentating on your talk. So one thing is some of the remarkable similarities between some of your approaches and what I'm considering a legal inflected STS, and that's probably because we share common progenitors, who I don't need to name. But this deep involvement and interest in considerations of publicly authorized power as an important site of doing STS and of examining the process of co-production. But in addition, lawyers or law STS folks pay close attention to constitutions, statutes, common law, natural law, the very process of codification, epistemologies of litigation, and courts as arenas that actually have a lot of similarities and common, again, progenitors with the laboratory, corporate legal structure, property, and intellectual property. And I would say law STS doesn't simply look at these in the world as contemporary things in the world and trace them as things of sociological inquiry or objects of sociological inquiry. Not simply, I think, actor categories. And this may be something that's a little different with law STS people. That there's a sense in which these structures, these concepts are themselves actors in the world or have traditions and long histories. And that part of what I'm interested in is these very long histories of these structures and ideas. I have zero time. So let me just say two more things. That's because I think this is one of the main things I want to say. One of the differences, too, I think, is I see the challenge of, I take it as part of my challenge and remit to develop deeper understandings in STS and law, but also then extend them or bring them into practice in policy communities. And so one of the things I struggle with developing a deeper, better account of the world, of the complex S&T worlds, is what do you do with that if you're interested in affecting change or in participating in S&TS or S&T policymaking of various kinds? So as a provocation of my own, I will ask 4 questions. They're hypothetical. The executive branch is calling for testimony on the governance of synthetic biology. Should an STS scholar be there to testify? Second, the position of Assistant Deputy Director in the Office of Science and Technology Policy opens up. Great. Would STS be in the appropriate skill set for filling the position? 3, the UN Secretariat appointed an STS expert to propose how members of the Small Island Developing States Network might be involved in the system for evaluating geoengineering research experiments that is currently developing. What would an STS expert say in that situation? 4, and finally, a coalition of industry actors and academics have formed a consortium to construct new industry standards for green chemistry. Should STS be there, and could they participate? So my thesis is that the answer should be yes to all of those questions. Yes as an ethical obligation. Yes as a rallying point for STS identity. Yes in order to generate better research data and questions. And yes as a practical means of making visible our field's contributions.
Great. So let me add yet another counter-provocation to Kaushik's provocation. First of all, Kaushik, thank you for a very thoughtful and a very open-ended provocation. I'm going to try to prolong the ideas and the trains of thought that I identified in Kaushik's introduction into a general discussion. I think Kaushik provides here and obviously in his scholarship a very forceful answer to what I think is the central question that this meeting tries to tackle, and that is, where should STS go in the next 10 or 20 years? Where should the field travel? What are the elsewheres that we should try to frequent? And what are the boundaries that we should try to cross in trying to get there? Now, obviously, the field is not going to stand still. For me, the most striking and intriguing lesson from yesterday's presentations was that there is a certain restlessness about STS. STS appears almost everywhere, mostly unannounced or unexpected. It appears in the law, in the courts, in constitutional theory. It appears in financial trading rooms. Obviously, the field has been constituted by very unexpected appearances in places where people were not anticipating it, going back to the foundational move to show up in a laboratory, asking a very odd set of questions. So there is STS and the critical sensibilities of STS travel very widely, travel very well. There's, again, a certain restlessness about the field. Now, obviously, the field hasn't gone everywhere, and Kaushik has identified, I think, two critical elsewheres where he argues we should try to spend more time. He's proposing, in a way, two journeys that we haven't fully undertaken yet. The first one is the journey into the post-genomic era of the life sciences, to try to critically accompany the life sciences as they become post-genomic and as they embrace notions of complexity, contingency, fluidity, translation, even sometimes idioms of co-production that are sometimes uncomfortably close to our own understanding of the world. Now, he's proposing a journey into the post-genomic because he thinks, and this applies to obviously to the second journey too, that this is a way of reinvigorating or at least retaining the critical sensibilities of the field, because when we recognize ourselves a little bit too much in the objects and processes that we study, as he put it, a simply oppositional critique won't do anymore. Now, the second journey is the journey into what he describes as the global post-colonial. Now, this is, as he put it very eloquently, rather a displacement or a back and forth movement between Western and non-Western imaginaries of science, technology, and democracy. To attend to the global post-colonial implies that we will discover moments and locations where universal imaginaries of science and technology begin to unravel. Now, I think there is no question that these are two very worthy destinations. These are two journeys worth embarking on. My question is how to get there. Now, if we know something in STS, is that there is no free traveling. There is no movement without friction. There is no displacement without distortion. There is no translation without a degree of betrayal. So I would like to open a discussion about how to travel to these new places that Kaushik is proposing that we go to pay more attention to the locomotions of STS, if you want. And here I have a point, and I will follow David's lead. in particular in relation to the travel to the global post-colonial, and what are the right companions for that journey? What is the baggage, the critical baggage of STS that we should take with us? What is the baggage that we should leave behind? And in particular, this connection with anthropology, which David alluded to and was very visibly presented in Kaushik's written provocation. To put it again in David's terms, whether or what is the difference between an anthropology of science and technology and an STS that is inflected with anthropological concerns and modes of attention. And here I'm also going to reflect on my own professional experience as someone who was trained in STS at Cornell in a very disciplinary fashion, STS as an emerging discipline, but who finds himself teaching in a business school. Now, yesterday somebody compared the transition from law to the social sciences as a movement from a desert into a swamp. This doesn't quite apply to the transition from an STS department into a business school. I like to compare it to abandoning the Garden of Eden as far as STS is concerned and showing up in the state of nature as described by Hobbes. Now, I think there are some advantages, at least intellectual advantages, to being in the state of nature. And one is that one cannot align himself too much or too closely with any other discipline, because a business school, at least the one I work in, is not so much a multidisciplinary space as a disciplinary or sometimes anti-disciplinary space. So there are all kinds of intellectual and non-intellectual transactions one has to conduct, but there is no question of borrowing too closely or aligning oneself too closely with any other disciplinary formation. One has to make the case for STS as such, and we survive or succeed or fail as STS. We cannot afford to become something else. There is nothing else to join, with the possible exception, and this goes back to a discussion yesterday, of the impact of the social studies of finance and the STS of finance on the discipline of finance itself. And there are some recent examples of STS scholars joining business schools or management departments to do STS of finance and joining as experts in finance. Anyway, that was my personal counterpoint. Again, I think the question of the elsewheres, I think, is incredibly relevant to our discussion. We are a restless field. I think that has to do with the relative institutional homelessness of STS, but it's also one of the reasons why everybody in this room remains excited about this project. The question for me is not whether we should try to go new places, but how to get there with what intellectual companions, especially if we want to retain the critical sensibilities that are specific to our field.
So, of course, we're going to open this up for discussion and for questions, and hopefully for each of our panelists to respond to one another. To kick things off, I'm going to steal the floor and ask a couple of questions of my own, partly as a way to bridge some of these analyses. So one way to begin, I think, is to try and bring back together David's first comments and Kaushik's paper by noting that, Kaushik, you begin by relating the biopolitical and the high-tech techno-scientific. You end by invoking Dipesh Chakrabarty. And one of the interesting things about that, which makes it a kind of an odd framing, is that for Chakrabarty, of course, at least in Provincializing Europe, one of the ways in is to actually push on a group, peasant culture within India. This is the long link to subaltern studies, where the whole point is that this group at least does not speak a shared language of modernity with Indian elites or the West. So this is actually a way to pull apart the assumptions of modernity by not beginning with modernity is the thing that we study. And so, of course, the problem that he points to is that this actually causes a major crisis for the rationalism of history as it tries to grapple with the fact that peasants don't just believe but in a world of, but inhabit a world of ghosts and spirits, and you need to deal with multiple ontologies. So the question here is, there are two parts. What happens if we start thinking about the biopolitical and we don't start with the techno-scientific, we don't start with the high-tech? So, one, a provocation to your provocation, and I'll put it, bluntly to overstate it, but one, having begun with a critique of neoliberalism, surely it's a neoliberal imaginary. We're talking about MIT and THSTI counts as analysis of the global. And two, then the more general, and I have to say more generous question, what does contemporary biopolitical life look like for actors who are, of course, political actors, but are not, and I'll phrase this in multiple ways, not fluent in a language of modernity, or to say it better, as Akhil Gupta does it, speaking a hybrid language of modernity, speaking multiple languages that are modern, or that speak at multiple registers of modernity, so that we don't fall into this opposition between the traditional and the modern, but we also don't simply reify a single form of post-colonial globality as modernity. So, do you want to kick off an answer?
Do you want me to respond to that? Oh, okay. I'm still noting all your wonderful points. But
well, we can do that, and we can get more questions, whichever you'd rather.
I can say a few things if you like, because there are lots on the table. So thanks to all three of you, and I'm just trying to organize for myself what way to get back, to put some things on the table here, right? And one of the things that is at stake here, well, let's start with the how do we get there question. The simple answer is I don't know. That's why I make these provocations, right? If I knew, I would tell you. But there is, partly because these things are not, simple problems with solutions, but they're ongoing questions of method. But one of the things that I suggested in my provocation is that the question of post-coloniality is not simply a question of alterity, right. And there is a way in which posing it as a question of alterity can be problematic. Mm-hmm. One of the things that you alluded to, Suman, in your response is the fact that even if what is at stake is not alterity, there might be at stake incommensurability. Mm-hmm. Right? And so the assumptions of commensuration between different places is itself starting with a certain set of assumptions. Now, I start with those sets of assumptions in what I am saying, because those are the assumptions my actors have. Of course, even the most resolutely anti-colonial, socialist, committed to social justice of these actors are caught in webs of neoliberal global capital in all sorts of ways. There are huge presumptions of articulatory capacity between these actors to start with. But I'm also, I don't want to keep incommensurability at a distance, but I also want to be wary of embracing it too much. So one way of reading Chakrabarty's problematic that you mentioned is that there are incommensurable ontologies, mm-hmm. and this is also the move that perhaps more strongly than Chakrabarty is made by Madeline Strathern, mm-hmm. right? But the reason why I'm reluctant to go down that road too much is because at the end of the day, I see that as a relativizing move as well. As here are these incompatible others, there's the this and there's the that. And the other way to read the Chakrabarty problematic is not that you have incommensurable ontologies here, but that there are differential relationships of figure and ground that are at stake, right? The very grounds upon which problems are posed might be different. They're certainly different if you're not talking about Indian scientists, but are talking about, if you like, those who are not caught up in modernity in the same way. But even amongst Indian scientists, the grounds are different. What's interesting to me about elite communities such as Indian scientists is because of their cosmopolitanism, they're able to code switch with remarkable sophistication. So literally, physically, I mean, some of them were at MIT earlier this week. They can come here and they can talk one language. And then they can go back and they can switch back into, so they can switch grounds, right? And so to sort of make that response a little bit more tangible, for instance, let me go back to David's first point about the question of innovation being a question not just of thinking about India as another place, but also thinking of the shifting places of power globally. And I think that's entirely true, and I think that point is very well taken. But it's also shifting in the context where there are differential articulations of what the grounds of innovation themselves are, right? So your hyper neoliberal, hyper capitalist actors are also very concerned with the poor. There's enormous bottom of the pyramid rhetoric that's operational in both American and Indian contexts. And indeed, if you're talking about the public health landscape in India, it's entirely constituted by Gates. But it's an imagination of the poor that presumes, again, technocracy, that you build the technology and it will get down to the poor, and that presumes the seamless functioning of trickle-down economics, even though we know for 200 years that trickle-down doesn't work, right? And so that's in tension with other kinds of definitions of innovation, even within the groundswell of new centers of power. These are not just different definitions of innovation, there are also different grounds upon which even the problem of innovation is imagined as a technocratic problem as opposed to a sociological problem. It's still trapped, as you rightly point out, within the question of representation. At the end of the day, you're still dealing with elite communities who are speaking for others who are not at the table. And it's very powerfully the case that there are lots and lots and lots of people, not just in post-colonial locales, but in advanced liberal locales who are not at the table, and we mustn't forget that as STS analysts. But for me, the solution to that vexed question of representation is not to pretend that I can speak for those who are not at the table, right? Because and this is an old problem of representation. I want to make a suggestion. Well, let me.
Perhaps we could make it very briefly, because I want to get.
But let's open it up, and then I'll figure out a way to respond to some more points of David's in response.
Fantastic. At the back there, I don't know if we need a microphone.
Thanks. Steve Epstein, Northwestern University. I want to pick up on some points that all the three of you have made, I think, very effectively, but also focus attention on the title of the session, Defining the Boundaries, which I think is an interesting title because it's kind of a classic STS task. We're very skilled about going into domains of practice and figuring out in a descriptive rather than prescriptive way what the boundaries might be by looking at what people are doing and what they're claiming and tracing boundary work and looking at boundary objects and how they travel or don't. But also, I think by looking at the cultural and political opportunity structures within which those rhetorical claims or attempts to position a field either find some leverage or some ground or don't. And so, in thinking about a restless field that pops up in, or seeks to pop up in unexpected places, I wonder then about the extent to which those places are receptive or resistant to such popping up, and the degree to which that matters in the evolution of a field. In thinking about traveling to new places, I wonder about the ways in which the world is open to or resistant to that travel. And so I guess I wanted to invite the panelists to just speak a little bit more in this sort of descriptive way, putting on the STS hats about STS, to talk about the defining the boundaries of the field in relation to this question of the situatedness of STS in a world that may or may not be interested in where it's making its appearances or traveling to.
Okay, I'll start. Yeah, so classically, STS is good at tracing boundary work and also tracing at how those boundaries are constructed and porous and chosen. The work of a lot of policy is to close boundaries, redefine them, and to some extent build them up, or to at least think about ways of engaging or understanding boundaries differently. So I think it's very hard, though, in the arenas that I've been involved in, policy arenas, it's been difficult for me to negotiate the boundary of my STS hat and my policy hat. And there's this impulse to just hang the STS hat at the door, or it's very difficult to bring that hat in and function productively wearing that hat. So it's something I struggle with all the time. I have some ideas. I think that we're good at also understanding that certain types of patterns lead to closing certain kinds of problems in more or less acceptable ways to more or less acceptable ways to different kinds of communities. So by understanding how things open and close, it puts us in a position to help do that. But it doesn't tell us where to do that and when to exactly do that, or when to keep the boundaries open. One last thing. In general, the thrust of STS is critique, I would say, is to complicate boundaries and to describe in more detail or to bring out the complexity. There's I haven't read many academic pieces that say, well, it's in STS, it's really much more simple than you think. Right? And how many articles have argued that? Usually it's much more complicated than people have made it out. That scheme is too simple. There's a vast oversimplification. Well, what would an STS look like that actually said, no, it's actually simpler than that, and there are implications of that simplicity for policy.
I'd answer that question at a couple of different levels, and one of those levels will directly answer you, and another will be in conversation with David's earlier question that I wanted to avoid but now won't. Right? So the first level is at the level of intervention, regardless of the sort of disciplinary location that one is coming from, right? And here I would say that the question here is, I would suggest that the leverage that's at stake is not just leverage into policy making, but is a leverage into praxis, broadly speaking, of which policy making is definitely an important domain. And the reason that I say praxis rather than policy making is not simply to suggest that praxis is bottom up and policy making is top down, but to suggest that there are quite different cultures of cultures in quotes, of policy making in different parts of the world. And so the modality of intervening in the political is quite differentially constituted. And I'm by no means making a claim that a place like India is more seamlessly democratic than a place like the US, but certainly the way in which the incorporation of civic epistemology into the apparatus of state state technocratic thinking happens is quite different in the US compared to India. So there, and so there is a way in which in India, for instance, constantly one of the sites at which one can enter, at which reception happens, is that very, very often whenever there are science policy issues that are being debated legislatively, there's a civil society consultative mechanism. One of which I've been involved in recently over the passage of the Indian version of the Bayh-Dole Act, which is quite interesting at a number of levels in terms of inserting oneself into that. But the other question here is, this also opens up for me the boundaries between anthropology and STS. And the reason I didn't want to answer that question, David, is because, I don't know how to locate myself there most of the time, and most of the time I don't really think about it. So whenever I'm with anthropology communities, I very strongly claim to be an STS person, and whenever I'm amongst STS people, I strongly claim to be an anthropologist, and it's quite nice to do that. But at some level, amongst my actors, again, there are differential sensibilities in how this is coded, and I'm doing caricatures here. But over and over again, I'm struck by how amongst the Indian scientists that I talk to, it's easier to pass off as STS. I mean, they're kind of open to anthropology as a description as well, but they recognize that there are people in the world who are engaged in critical interlocution of the relationship between the techno-scientific and the social, because they often see themselves as engaged in that kind of interlocution as well, even if sometimes in unreflexive ways. The predominant way in which the American biologists I've dealt with have accepted me in is, oh, you're doing cultural analysis. And so it's very easy for me to pass off as an anthropologist. And again, I'm happy to wear that garb if that gets me in the door. Even though to anthropologists, I often say, well, I'm not doing cultural analysis, and there's a rich history in the anthropological discipline of knowledge projects and not culture projects. So there are ways in which the final point that I might say, and this is just a question also of, is the critical place of the legal here, certainly in the work that I'm doing now, not just as a separate discipline whose boundaries have to be crossed, but also the way in which, certainly in the Indian context, the way in which the social often intrudes upon these techno-scientific policy decisions is through the medium of the law. Not just because a lot of these issues are getting resolved in the courts, but also because, I'm doing two projects. One of them is translational research. The other one is looking at how intellectual property regimes are being reconfigured in the Indian pharmaceutical industry after WTO and the consequences for access to medicines. And these are two entirely separate communities, the patient activists on the one hand and the scientists on the other. The only thing that both of them care about is intellectual property. And the only thing that brought them into the room together were these discussions on the Indian Bayh-Dole Act, which the patient advocates are terrified about and which the scientists think are absolutely essential. And so in the civil society consultations, these were the groups facing off. And actually, I was the only one who knew both of them. They didn't know each other, and they came with different Bibles. The Indian Constitution was carried by the activists represented by the lawyers, and they came with different epistemologies, not just with different ontologies. And so the way in which the legal is emerging as a sort of boundary object in these battles is very, very interesting.
Javier, do you want to weigh in?
Sure. Yeah. In addition to what David and Kaushik have said, I think there is two different ways of maybe tackling Steve's question about a world with different degrees of resistance to STS. And I think that could be broken up in two questions. One is the resistance of different objects, settings, practices to becoming objects of STS inquiry. And then how does STS infiltrate those objects, those settings, those practices? And the other question is, and this is a question that Kaushik was posing, what sort of critique can STS still deploy in the places where its ideas have been better received, or the places that are more permeable to STS understandings. In relation to the first question, you know, how does STS infiltrate sort of difficult domains? I think you know, we should do a bit of STS and probably do an STS intellectual history of our field. And I think my vision is that STS travels slowly, to continue the traveling metaphor, which is a very risky metaphor. It travels slowly in the sense that we tend to offer empirically rich re-descriptions of those settings, those objects, those practices, those institutions, and that takes time. It requires that we acquire vernacular languages. I think STS also travels lightly in the sense that we generally tend not to extend our reach by means of theory, at least not by articulating sort of meta-narratives of the world. We wear our theory more lightly. I think that's a good way of traveling, slowly and lightly, especially if one wants to retain what's distinctive about the traveler. And in terms of what sort of critique to still deploy in the places that are most receptive to us, for me this is a question. I don't have an answer. I think I was very taken by Kaushik's point that it's simply oppositional critique won't do anymore. It reminded me of the long-standing discussion, particularly in Europe, about how to react to the participatory turn that many institutions have taken in relation to science and technology. The sort of invitation to dialogue, to public participation, to democratic deliberation as an institutional response to scientific and technological challenges. And my sense is that, and you know, people in this room have demonstrated this, is that there is still room for an oppositional critique. First of all, I think one has to relativize the degree to which the STS ideas have actually become operational, as opposed to adding to the institutional discourse. But even when they are, I think there's still opportunities for pushing harder and for establishing that sort of dialectical relationship between the critique and the established way of doing things.
I wonder if I might just quickly here question the question that we started with. Because it seems to me, again, to overstate it, that there's a kind of an arrogance to STS, that we think that in principle there is no problem to which our analysis cannot in principle be applied. And so I think, again, back to Chakrabarty, because I actually disagree with Kaushik's reading of this. I don't think his line is about relativism. The line is to argue that history fails for particular kinds of projects, that history as a rationalist enterprise can write the statement, peasants believe that they won this battle because gods came down to help them, but it cannot write, peasants won this battle because gods came down to help them. It can reduce everything to the common playing field of the modern West, right, a particular shared ontology, but actually it struggles desperately to deal with multiple competing ontologies. And so one of the ways to throw this question back, to try and get it, if I may, a little humility back into this, is for us to ask, where must STS, because of its structuring assumptions, fail? Because I think if our answer is nowhere, we've actually hit a problem. And that when we are faced with a panel that looks, for example, at the non-West, or if we have a panel that looks at a period before the 18th century, we should, in fact, struggle and stumble rather than working everywhere. So, you know, I can throw that out as a question. Where are we going to fail?
There was a question waiting there on the front.
Was there?
Yeah.
Super interesting and sorry? Oh, Ann Pollock from Georgia Tech. So really excellent food for thought here. And I just wanted to kind of toss in something that really brings together these two in places that you want to move and suggest that actually the U.S. is just as important a site for them. So When you talk about the post-genomic era and the global post-colonial, I think that this is so important for those who want to study, for example, race in the United States. Insofar as STS has studied race, it has almost exclusively been in genetics and the debunking thereof. And I think that that's a failure to adequately account for the role of race, including in expertise. But I think that the global post-colonial is then also important because I think that the fact that we've been able to account for biological citizenship in the US without accounting for mass incarceration, for example, is a way in which we're not actually accounting for the specificity of the facts on the ground. So homogenizing the global north, I think, is something that you have worked through in your own work to some degree by paying attention to evangelical Christianity as a force in American science. And I think that that's one of the ways in which the global north, too, is heterogeneous, and the distinctive history of the U.S. is important to understand what's going on here. And I'd just like to throw out there that the history of slavery and the present mass incarceration, the fact that we have both a society that's saturated with pharmaceuticals and a society in which there's radically unequal access to medicine, needs to be understood somehow together. And so I just wonder, if you have more thoughts about what the role of post-colonial critique should be for those who are working in the U.S. Mm-hmm. or in the UK or elsewhere.
Well, I mean, Anne, I agree with your point entirely because, and this is partly, I did suggest that for me, the question of the post-colonial is not a spatial question in simple terms, but is rather a sensibility. And so I think, and I think that the US is one of the most important and interesting places within which to view that sensibility. So my, and this is not just in order to suggest that that there are things happening in the US as well that we should pay attention to, but it's also to suggest that there are shared spaces of solidarity there if we really do think post-colonially, globally. How we do that, I'm trying to work through that as well, and Suman has extremely useful provocations in the limits of being too confident about doing that in certain kinds of ways. But I do want to throw in one thing that's in some ways in response to you, but also back to Steve and Suman's earlier point, which is that what is at stake here is not just studying here or there, or not just inserting oneself into here or there. And of course, when one is studying in multiple places, one of the most powerful sorts of tools, so how do we get there, is comparison. And that's very important. But I think we also insert ourselves as certain kinds of translational mediators. And one can do that in relatively humble ways as well, knowing that one is translating and mediating between people who are already at the table and so on and so forth. And in my own two current projects, I find myself, and this is one of the sites of receptivity, right, is that the people who are most receptive to me in the Access to Medicines project are Indian-based patient advocates who are fighting for access to essential medicines. The people who are most open to me in the Translational Research project are actually the MIT scientists. And both of them are looking to me to perform certain kinds of translational activity that are of very different orders, right? So the MIT scientists want me to explain what the Indian scientists are saying because there are so many gaps in understanding of where these people are coming from. And there I see my translational role, however humbly or arrogantly, as at some level keeping MIT in check. Right? It's like, don't assume that you know what these people are thinking and that you can just go in there and say you have to do this, that, and the other, as if the grounds for all of those are already configured in those same ways in India. My translational work for the patient activists, I see, as not keeping them in check, but actually being subversive and giving them information from the other side. It's like I've hung out with these scientists and policymakers, and I can tell you what they're thinking so that you can go and And again, that makes it sound too simply polemical. And of course, the complications of operating on those fields are very, very complicated, because at many times in these translations, I come to have enormous admiration for what the MIT scientists are doing and enormous problems with what the patient advocates are doing. But nonetheless, the nature of translation is differentially configured in these cases. And the last thing I want to throw out in response to this then is to go back to something that was mentioned yesterday, which is that partly what's at stake, as Brian suggested in these moments, is just getting it right. But if you get it right in different kinds of mediation, in different kinds of translation, and where the grounds are different, then the critical apparatus that comes forth is really of a quite different order. And I do wonder whether what is at stake here is also thinking not just of the work of critique that STS has to do or where it locates itself, but the multiplicity of forms that have to be brought to bear in the work of this critique. And so for me, Sheila's, Brian's, and David's amicus brief to the WTO is an entirely non-trivial piece of work here, not just for the content of what it says, but for thinking about different forms of intervention that STS can make. And so I also want to allude to the necessary importance of the sort of traditional book publication form, but often its limitations in projecting the kinds of critiques that we want to do, and maybe thinking through more seriously the multiple forms that our intervention can take, not just in terms of location, but actually in terms of artifact production might be worthwhile.
I think, Dan Plafkin? Yeah.
Hi, my name is Dan Plafkin. I work for the Department of Defense. So I'm in a location where often, of course, people are weary about operationalizing things. I want to go back to Javier's metaphor of traveling. Bob Axelrod, president of American Political Science Association meeting couple years back, stated that political science was very good at importing, this was his traveling sort of metaphor, importing lots of ideas from other disciplines, but not very good at exporting. And he wanted to see political science export a lot more. Well, this is sort of an oppositional framing of how STS is very good at traveling, profound engagement with both practitioners and other disciplines. But I want to suggest that, and this is why we're all here, is because when you travel, what enables you to travel successfully, is knowing that you can come back home. Otherwise, you're engaged in a different sort of enterprise altogether. And I know later on in this conference we've got some things along these themes, but I want to ask you, when you travel and then you come back home, what concepts or ideas or theories do you take back with you that you want to see us, your home, for the purpose of this discussion, build upon? Because I think that is my statement of where I think our challenges lie. Because I completely concur with Javier's, it's very nice to travel lightly the way exactly Javier described it, but nevertheless, it's still traveling. And in order to actually institutionalize and build in the academy in a way that political scientists can just take for granted in a way that we may not want to, but nevertheless, that would be sort of institutional sort of success for the sake of this question, or is it? I'm curious about how you would build up the home.
Javier, do you want to respond on what happens when you go back from Hobbes to the Garden of Eden?
I'm glad to be suffering the consequences of introducing travel to the discussion.
But you get to reverse the fall. I want to point this out.
So what do we take home from our travels? And again, this is, I think, a personal, I mean, one has to provide a personal answer to the question. What do I take home? I think, when you were describing the comment about importing, exporting, my personal reaction to that is that I don't think we, or I should say I, import very much from my travels. I mean, I try to come home with more than a souvenir, but I think the interesting question is how do how do we define our home? And in my case, it's not a, it doesn't have a very physical manifestation. It's made up of, well, the people in this room, the people probably watching us on the internet, a few journals, a particular way of attending to science and technology, and through science and technology to the world. It's a hybrid, eclectic, quite Catholic vocabulary. What I was trying to say earlier about traveling lightly had to do, I think, with, in my view, with the role of theory in our travels. I don't think STS travels by extending theory or making theoretical claims. I mean, there are examples of that, obviously, but I think what we offer are redescriptions of the world. I think Latour said many years ago that if you study something new and simply apply the things that you already knew, that's not a very enriching experience. But there is a limit to how much you can change from, based on the object that you study. And I think it's that tension that, to me, is interesting about the field.
So I should note we have more than 5 questions and less than half an hour. So if I can ask both questions and answers to be as short as we can make them. Where's our first one? Fantastic.
I have a friendly question to ask of David and another one of Suman. So David, you said provocatively that STS never says this is I'll tell you a simpler story than the one you've given me. But does that to you mean that we deny simplification, or simply that we're asking how did we get to the simplification, and maybe there are other ways of getting to simplifications as well? So is it, it is a frequent charge leveled against STS, and it goes back to Dan Plafkin's point a moment ago, that all you do is hand us more complexity and therefore we can't deal with it. But if you reverse or slightly modify that observation and instead say that any simplification has behind it a complexity of pathways by which you got there, and maybe by teaching about that pathway you could point to a different simplification to get to, would that not be a slightly different solution? And as you know, the WTO brief did have to have a conclusion. It did have to have, as a lawyer working for the WTO, you ought to go here, not there. And we were very well aware of that point. So I'd like to hear you say something about that. And Suman, arrogance and overreaching of disciplines, but what is that based on in your mind? I mean, are you imagining a set of axiomatic prescriptions that the field may not go there? Or is it not acceptable for a mode of thought and a community of thinkers through their practices to continually challenge the directions and boundaries of the things that they're investigating, and in that sense see the world as actually unbounded without being hubristic, because the practices actually impose their own constraints? So to look at history, 3 moves within relatively recent historical work that I think have been revolutionarily transformative for history in general, and these are not the only ones, were things that people once thought in history could not be done. So one of them is longue durée history, one of them is subaltern studies, and one of them is the sort of broadly speaking sites of memory project. So for various reasons, such as the absence of proper archives or not knowing what archives are, or not looking at the role of power within history and so on, these trends, these sort of, I think, massively transformative trends across the humanities and social sciences these can't be done history projects. Now they can be done history projects. So in that sense, should we not have the hubris to think that STS2 should have open-ended luxury to tread where it hasn't gone before?
I think that's to misread what Chuck about these critique is. The point that Chuck about these making, and the one that I'm echoing here, is not that we think history is easy everywhere or can be done, that sources aren't difficult to find, all of that kind of stuff. There's no problem with that. Chakrabarty's critique is that there's something about history as a product of modernity, something built into it through its rationalist assumptions that makes its ability to deal with problematizations of those fundamental assumptions. It breaks apart. And so Chakrabarty's response, and this is his language, is to point to the failure of history when it tries to deal with the multiple ontologies of the peasant, to take seriously the agency of gods, for example, as well as of human beings. So that's his claim, and I'm generalizing it to science and technology studies. One of the places where I think about this, so I can put my money where my mouth is, at least where the question lies. So in The Age of the World picture, Heidegger says, and he's critiquing questions of relativism, he says, look, we think that there was a classical world picture, a medieval world picture, a Renaissance world picture, and a modern world picture. They're all different epistemologies. He says, no, the key thing, the thing that makes moderns, is that they conceive of the world as picture, and then they read that backwards, and hence level this playing field. In terms of STS, my question that follows along these same lines is, again, to pull apart the kind of relativizing moves that we kind of smugly make. So one of them is our move that says that all knowledge is local. And one of the questions to ask here is, how do we have to conceive of knowledge such that the claim all knowledge is local is meaningful, right? So we have to begin with this kind of assumption that people can talk about universal knowledge and local knowledge, that you can split those apart conceptually, and then, of course, we need to make a series of moves about that. But one of the questions that we can push on there is to ask when and where knowledge becomes local, right? To problematize the foundational assumptions of STS. So it's not to say that we should give up, that there are, limits to the kinds of questions we can look at. It's to rather think about the structuring assumptions, to historicize and anthropologize STS, to locate it, and hence the kinds of questions, the structuring assumptions that it takes as being legitimate. That's where I'm pushing here. David.
Wow, I'm not sure I can follow that. So let me address the other question. Yeah, I mean, I'm not advocating for a kind of Malcolm Gladwell approach to scholarship where everything is reduced to a one-word idea and the kind that you can talk about in cocktail parties and sound smart. No, obviously, reductionism, simplicity is the appropriate target of a lot of good work in this field. My provocation here is to say that we really can't stop at complication, taking things apart. We actually have to push to the next point of, or I think a lot of us should, or I certainly see my role as pushing to the next point of reconstruction, reconfiguration, reinterpretation. And to be fair, yes, a lot of good STS work does that. But I think that's both in terms of an intellectual reformation of a field of understanding. But I think we could go the next step, which builds on, I think, stuff that we talked about yesterday, to institutional design. And can we actually move from STS work to the design, a better design of institutions that seems to avoid problems of various kinds that we've identified in our work. And that's a really interesting proposition for me and provocation for me, and I think it's an important one for the field to do as well.
We have one question here, two over there, and Tolu over there.
Okay, thank you.
Manjari Mahajan from New School University. Kaushik, thank you for, as always, a very thoughtful talk. But I must admit it was the ending which left me hanging, because it seems to me that's where the nub of the discussion, at least for me, is. So I completely agree with you that the imaginaries and the institutional arrangements and the sociologies of science and scientists in a place like India are very different from what you would find in a place like the United States, and they are to use your idiom, co-productionists. But I think you're also very correct in pointing out towards the end that these different tribes of scientists in India also hang on to this sense that science is universalistic, that the technologies, artifacts, practices are very universal. And so I guess you left it open as a question, but I want to push you a bit on it. What happens to an idiom like co-production, where you acknowledge different sociologies, imaginaries, but at the same time also hang on to the universalism? And how does this result in different kinds of concept formation, different epistemologies, and epistemic practices? And that's where I feel the real challenge for STS is. And I'm just curious as to what your ethnography with these translational research scientists might have revealed.
God, I'm glad that's your question.
Manjari, there's a reason that ending left you hanging. I mean, I don't know is the simple question. I mean, this is precisely the issue that I'm wrestling with, right? And some of this is, I mean, my entry points are often relentlessly empirical, in that I go in there and I really try and understand what the actors are saying. And this isn't to reify actors' categories as really real, but it is to say that the structuring of the world from their perspectives is sort of consequential for me. And it leaves me, I mean, the ending is a question. It leaves me at precisely this moment, right, where you have this sort of articulation coming out of a place like India, and I don't want to make any further generalizations than that right now, which is about the sort of merging of an insistence on sociological particularity with epistemic universality. And I mean, this question of does this lead to a different kind of science is one that I'm wrestling with myself, one that I'm posing back to my informants with answers that, and it's clear that they don't know how to think about it. And it's really something that I would like to think through. I mean, this provocation is written very much as license to express my own doubts and confusions rather than to, but I agree with you. I think it is the nub of the matter. Partly because what is at stake here is is the question itself of what a different kind of science means, right? Is that different kind of science a question of epistemic difference, a question of institutional difference, a question of both, a question of a particular kind of relationship of the epistemic to the institutional, and where do those relationships get forged, right? And that in and of itself is a co-productionist question. So I'm sorry I don't have an answer to this, but it's just to reiterate the fact that this is precisely what I'm grappling with. So if you can tell me how to work through this, then I mean, there's a longer conversation to be had here, of course.
There's a couple of questions, please.
Sharon Koo from National Institute of Health. I was trained, I came here with a lot of questions. I was trained as a STS person, but now I'm kind of consider myself as a STS practitioner, work for the government agency. And so I'm glad to hear this Professor Kaushik's presentation on translational research. Currently, I'm involving in a project of translational medicine in the U.S. And so I actually take a lot of questions and doubts, confusion in my mind. I like to discuss and share and hopefully get some feedback from the STS community from a practitioner's point of view. So I did observe a lot of similarities between what you described, what happened in India and the U.S. The notion of translation in NIH is translational medicine, of course, is to take a particle or drug from the bench to the bedside. So it's making the object travel But this idea was raised in late 1990. After 10 years, I think those policymakers realized that it is not just a technical project to make object travel, it's also a social mobilization, that you need to make your knowledge, know-how, people, information, data, instruments, everything travel well. And so I think from this point of view, STS is really very helpful to help them conceptualizing their work. But I also noticed there is this kind of a co-production of knowledge and knowledge maker. Also, there's a different level of question is redefining self. And what happened within the NIH is, well, actually a lot of self-question, identity crisis at the very individual level. For example, scientists started to question that should we, government scientists, act like a scientist in pharmaceutical company because they need to do translation research. So you see these kind of, they are doubting their identity. They are not so happy with what they claim want to do. And also not just the individual level, also interdisciplinary collaboration, physics, biology, and also, as you pointed out, very important is the institutional level. Like, in order to make things translatable, FDA has to collaborate with the NIH. And all these government agencies need to collaborate. But there's a very big cultural issue among these different agencies that make them, they cannot agree on certain things. Also, even at the international level, so like
could we possibly table that as a comment?
Sure. So my question is really, from this different level of problem, I think there's a three issue. First, I like to hear is micro and macro. As trained as STS, I feel I was told this kind of ethnographic technique, how to do laboratory study. But when I encounter these macro-level problems, like institution, political, international, I don't know what theory we can use. The second is this local.
Sorry, we have a large number of questions. Could
yes.
you pick your favorite one and
okay. First is micro and macro. The second is local and global. The third is the problem of authority. And so these three questions I'd like to ask. Any theoretical?
Okay, so let me give you a quick answer on at least maybe micro and macro with an example, right? So that my question here, or my interest here, is of course micro macro. It's a scalar question. Global local. It's a spatial question. But it's also the ways in which those very questions are differentially configured in different places, right? So the relationship of micro to macro is not necessarily the same in India and the US. And I'll just give you one simple example of this, right? One of the things that's really confusing in this collaboration is that the basic metrics are utterly different at least two levels, right? One level is at the level of funding. So you have a situation here where the Indian government has decided to devote 2% of GDP to science and technology. Now, given the institutional capacity to absorb that in India, this is an enormous amount. So what this means is that scientists are flush with money and they're complaining that they don't know how to spend it. So when they're hiring junior faculty from the US, they're giving what's our startup package? Whatever you want. Tell us what you want. You want an NMR facility? We'll give it to you. Blank checks, right? 100% of grant applications to the Department of Biotechnology are being funded, and this is at a moment of budget crisis in the NIH. So on the one hand, there's this entirely different sense of abundance, right? But on the other hand, there is very differential ideas of institutional capacity to absorb that abundance. So in one frame of reference is that suddenly locations like India and perhaps Singapore and China and so on are flush with money that doesn't exist in places like the US and the UK. But on the other hand, it still remains that in many ways, MIT is richer than India, right? And so one of the things that, there's this whole question of money here. The MIT-India collaboration is the Indian government paying MIT $5 million over 5 years. And the Indian government didn't pay for a long time because the Indian government takes time to pay money. And so there was this question of, the person involved at MIT was telling MIT, shouldn't you be starting to ask for this money because it will take some time. They were like, $5 million, it doesn't matter. The Spanish government is paying them $15 million just to open a center, right? So $5 million is peanuts for MIT. For the Indian government, it's an enormous amount of taxpayer money. And this is not just a different question of scale, but it really means that at the nitty-gritty of practice, accountability looks different in the two places, right? So the Indians are constantly saying, well, show us what you're doing with all of this money. And they're like, what money? So how do you even think about scale in these two contexts where it's just differentially configured in all sorts of ways?
We have 1, 2, 3 more questions.
Great.
Thanks very much. Ben Hurlbut from Arizona State University. So Kaushik, this is directed towards you. This is probably an unfair, borderline rude question, but I know you can take it, so I'll ask it anyway.
From you, I'll take it.
So your very compelling discussion of and in your own work demonstration of the value of looking to elsewheres, I commend tremendously. But I want to ask a question that's partly theoretical, but I think also partly ethical. So elsewheres are clearly analytically productive, but they also generate, as clear from your comments and your work, normative elsewheres, normative alternatives. And it seems to me that while these can be very analytically and normatively productive, they also contain certain risks of distractions, partly because built in sometimes potentially is a particular kind of elsewhere, a nowhere, a utopianism that invites certain kinds of flattening, where we can understand in a quick sentence what the hyper-capitalist, hyper-neoliberal Indian is versus the sort of co-productionist identity that you described. Mm-hmm. So it seems to me Steve Epstein's question, which was partly strategic, also is analytic, in the sense that what forms of permeability, flexibility, et cetera, exist in complex socio-technical configurations that allow us to get in and understand things, but also allow those configurations to reinvent themselves, and his work precisely demonstrates exactly this phenomenon. It seems to me that in looking to elsewheres, there's a risk, in the invitation for a kind of utopianism, there's a risk that we're distracted from the thickness of the world that's immediately before us, and the normative flexibility that's built into it, and that the repository of the good in a configuration that's immediately before us may look dystopian by virtue of seeing another place where a certain form of agency with a certain kind of normative orientation is immediate and doesn't require critique and analysis to elicit. So my question is how do you contend with this theoretically and ethically? And when we come to questions like David's, what do we want our people to do if put into positions of power? How does this sort of utopianism figure? Do we want an STS scholar in OSTP because then we can rule the world properly, or because it can engender alternative forms of experimentation, alternative pathways of simplification that we maybe don't have any authority to sort of normatively designate preferences for, but nevertheless have a theoretical capacity to understand.
Okay, great. I'm going to let Kaushik respond, and then our other speakers would like to respond to a couple of other questions, and then we have 2 more questions from the floor. I think we just have time.
Okay, I hope this will do as an answer, but let me answer that by pulling on other things that have come up, right? First is the question of coming home. And the second is this line that Javier said in his responses of the discomforts when we get close to the objects of our study because they're not so easy to just critique in denunciatory terms anymore, right? So in my case, the coming home is sort of oddly configured, right? Because on the one hand, my home is India, And so there are a deep set of ethical and normative commitments that have to do with that. And so I do speak from a place where India is not the other, and there is a sort of naive, positivist, utopian commitment to wanting to see good science done otherwise there, right? And an insistence on these institutions being successful. I have that desire. But also home for me is biology. I was trained as a biologist, and I was formally trained in STS for 5 years. I was formally trained in biology for 6. And so the possibility of other kinds of biology taking shape that are more interesting than the extremely reductionist and uninteresting ones that do float around is also a deep commitment to me. And the third home is MIT, where I got my PhD, and there's something about being with MIT scientists that I get access because I can speak their language. I understand where they're coming from, and I realize now how there's a certain ethos that does exist at MIT STS that is not radically distinct from the ethos of MIT as a university, though how that plays out is a complicated question, right? And so rather than the trope of utopianism, I would suggest, so I don't know the answer of how to deal with this, but it is the situation in which I'm located. And I think that we're all located in very different ways in these kinds of situations, depending on where we come from. And there has to be a way to take account of that that's not just reflexivity. But rather than utopianism, I might suggest the trope of deep seduction, right? Especially because Javier also mentioned this other keyword, betrayal. You know, a lot of this for me is not looking at utopian futures where I know what science should be and I know what the global order should be and that I intervene in that. A lot of this is about getting deeply involved with people who have a series of passionate commitments that I'm not able to view simply in cynical terms, and then figuring out in often painful ways the ways and times at which I and other people get betrayed by those things, because certain long durée structural inequalities keep reasserting themselves, keep occluding the possibilities for certain kinds of critique that we regard as STS, keep pulling us in and then shutting the door on us. And it's not just me, often my scientists get those kinds of betrayals as well from each other and from the world around them.
Well, I would like to go back to Suman's own provocation about the limits, the structural limits to STS, the boundary conditions of STS, because I think it's a very good question. I don't agree with your answer though. But it helped me.
I probably don't agree with it either.
But it helped me think through the question. I mean, for instance, I don't recognize, all knowledge is local as an axiom of STS. I think there is a difference between, paying attention to the conditions under which and the work with which knowledge becomes translocal, and on the other hand,
knowledge is produced locally.
Well, but to put that as an axiom, I think
It's often, yeah, all right, go on. But
Anyway,
I think it is often invoked as an axiom, so.
I mean, the point I wanted to make is that I think, it's an empirical question to test the limits of STS, and it has to do not with the validity of a certain set of axioms, but with whether our descriptions of the world are convincing. And that is the practical limit that we have. I don't think it's a philosophical limit in the sense that there are some built-in axiomatic statements that we carry with us. And this applies also to the issue of incommensurability, which Kaushik has alluded to and I have written about. I don't think incommensurability is for us, or should be, an axiom. It's, to be ethnomethodological about it. This is a practical achievement. And we pay attention to, more or less successfully, how that achievement comes about. And I think there was a very nice phrase in Kaushik's provocation, which was, STS as I think a mode of attentiveness and conceptualization. I think it's important to struggle not to formulate axioms.
Maybe we can get the last two questions and group them and end with a brief response.
Okay.
Lost with those. Fantastic.
Yeah. So my name is Tolu Odumosu, but I'm not asking a question as myself. David Dermotane from LSE has a question for David Winnikoff, and he says, is it possible to be a constructionist policymaker? Policymaking involves realpolitik, strategic analysis of interests involved, and some amount of conflict. Is STS realist or realistic enough to participate in policymaking and make a difference?
And there was a second one, I think. Is there one more question from the park or up there? Miles? Then it's probably Park.
Thank you. Park Doing from Cornell. So it's really a rephrasing of Javier. He spoke while I was in line. And I suppose it's no surprise since we were similarly trained. But the question is that it seems to me STS has a legacy of precisely looking head-on at issues of incommensurability and universality. And so indeed, even as we've been speaking in this room during this session, we've seen people wrestle with this very issue. And so it seems to me that what you pose as a weakness of STS is precisely a core of its strength. And so the question would be, perhaps you could elaborate on why incommensurability marks the end of STS analysis rather than the beginning.
Okay, So the question was a good one. Can you be a constructivist and engaged in policy? And I would say, yes. In fact, it makes you a better policy actor because you see the world, you see that and how things are actually made, right? You actually can take apart things in the world, and that implies that it might make you a better situated to put them back together. Now, that doesn't mean that you're going to do that and act for the good as defined, however you want to define it. It does perhaps arm you to be more capable and a better strategist at making the kinds of constructions you would like to make.
I suppose, Park, I'm not sure I would stick with the language of incommensurability. The one I like is relativism. And Heidegger's point, and the one that I'm simply moving along with, is to note that relativism can itself be historicized as a move, that there are particular forms of relativism that rest on particular structuring assumptions. I mean, frankly, I'm a little skeptical of this notion that STS can be aware of everything, because it of course assumes that then we have no assumptions we take as fixed, that we then problematize everything simultaneously, which I don't think we do. I think there are things that are, if not axiomatic, I think we can avoid that language, but that are fundamental to our field, and of course they are, because our field is born in particular moments in particular places, right? And if we take that seriously, then there are going to be structuring assumptions. And then the question is not, I think, an empirical one, which is about whether we can make things meaningful, because of course that point is about paradigms. Things are made meaningful given certain structuring assumptions. To then say, well, I've rendered it meaningful, is only to say that I've simply reconstituted my structuring assumptions. The question is whether we can make an extra step to relativize relativism, so to speak, to historicize the particular forms of relativism that we make, and therefore use that as a self-reflexive critique of some of our own structuring assumptions. That's the move, right? And to say that we already do that, I think, is not true. I think we're reflexive about lots of things. I don't think that we're reflexive about all things. And the simple question, which is, surely there must be things. If we are a discipline rooted in history, there are kinds of questions that we're going to find more difficult or even impossible. I think we should grant that just as a given, and then try and see where they are. I find it hard to believe that those things don't exist.
It should be an object of study.
Correct. But whether it can be studied within STS is another question, and that's Chakrabarty's point. Where history fails, actually getting into that for Chakrabarty, cannot be studied by history. History can identify the limit. It cannot keep going. Right? We're out of time. Please join me in thanking our speakers.